So I thought we'd finish the series, but it turns out I didn't do the USSR mid-war cards. So here we are. Welcome back, everybody, to now what is actually the final installment of the Winning Agenda's Twilight Struggle new player series, where I've gone through all the cards in the Twilight Struggle deck, talked about what they do, how you can think about playing them strategically, and hopefully given you a bit of a primer on the game. So yes, this false alarm last time wasn't actually the final episode. Here we are, as many people pointed out in the comments, with the actual final episode. After this, we will have actually gone through all the cards in the deck. So the mid-war deck, as we discussed back in episode 5, I think, is the largest part of the Twilight Struggle deck, or the largest deck that gets added. We went through the USA cards, of which there are quite a few. The neutral cards, again, quite a few really important neutral cards. And now we've landed on the USSR part of the deck. So one of the really important things to think about with neutral cards, with mid-war cards, is the ones that aren't starred events, you're usually going to see them twice in a game. And like the non-starred early war cards, which you'll sometimes see 3 times in a game, being aware of where they are in the deck, whether they've been played, whether they're going to be coming back again, and for the more impactful ones, whether you're still in danger of being hit by them again once in the game is really important, as well as potentially holding them through the reshuffle and then dumping them afterwards. There are probably, as we discussed in the USA mid-war section, some more impactful non-starred USA events like Voice of America. But as we go through this section of the deck, you'll also notice that there are some quite powerful non-starred USSR cards as well. So we're starting off here with a starred event called Quagmire. So it's removed from play once it's used for the event. And it's actually the mirror image of Bear Trap, which we discussed in the USA part of the game, of the deck rather. So Quagmire says on their next action round, the US player must discard an operations card worth 2 or more and roll 1 to 4 to cancel this event. Repeat each US action round until successful or no appropriate cards remain in their hand. If they're out of appropriate cards, the US player may only play scoring cards until the next turn, otherwise they have to pass. What this means functionally, as we discussed with Bear Trap, is that there's a few things here and a few card interactions that are really important. One is that if you're under Purge or another effect that's reducing the operations value of your cards, you can't essentially pitch your 2-ops cards to the Quagmire anymore. So if you, as a USSR player, put them in the US player in the Quagmire, they've got a handful of 2-ops cards, but you've also headlined Red Scare Purge. They can't throw those 2-ops cards to the Quagmire. They need to have 3s. And if they're out of 3s or 4s, then they can't do anything for the entire turn. So it's obviously a very strong combo. If you can Red Scare into Quagmire, that can be really strong. Or Red Scare Purge into Quagmire. But there are also a few interesting strategic considerations with Quagmire, especially compared with Bear Trap, that are quite important. So another one is that Quagmire cancels NORAD. So if NORAD is in effect and Quagmire is played, the NORAD effect will be cancelled immediately. So sometimes, particularly if you get NORAD on turn 3 and you really need the 3-ops as the USSR player, you might gamble by playing NORAD, even though it's a really powerful effect in the mid-war, hoping that you draw Quagmire. So that's just an important thing to be aware of. I wouldn't usually recommend doing that, but there are some game situations where that turns out to be a gamble worth taking. Because, of course, there's around a 50% chance that you, as the USSR player, are going to draw the Quagmire during the mid-war period. The other interaction that's important with Quagmire is thinking about it as the Soviet player. Compared with the American player, you actually have this opportunity to headline Quagmire, have your first action round, they effectively skip their first action round, and then you get your second. So you have a lot of information when you can use Quagmire at arguably its most powerful, as opposed to the USA player, where if they headline Quagmire, they only get 1 action round before the Soviet player gets to go again. So Quagmire as a headline for the USSR can actually be really powerful for that reason. You then get to string together 2 action rounds in a row. Arguably for the US player, they've had AR7, and then if they headline Bear Trap, they get AR1, so they've got 2 action rounds in a row. But because you've got all the information as the Soviet player as to the fact that you've got Quagmire and what the rest of your plays are going to be at the time you make the choice to event it, it's a little bit more powerful in that regard. The other way that Quagmire is a little more powerful than Bear Trap is that you can deprive the USA player of their AR7, which is very good. So not allowing them to, if you feel like they're most likely to have either kept a really powerful event to try and remove some of your influence, for example, or a play that's going to try and break open one of your battlegrounds to fork you on your next AR1 and your next headline, then eventing Quagmire on your AR7 deprives them of their AR7 and potentially, if you're lucky, also their next AR1 as well. So yeah, a really powerful event, a card that I tend to event more often than not as the Soviets, because you can usually find a window to event it, and I think probably the most powerful event in the Soviet mid-war deck, although there are a few other really good ones that can be impactful. I would say, though, that a lot of the other impactful Soviet events, once the opposing player knows about them, they can kind of play around them a bit more. They're kind of more blowouts for new players. But yeah, there are a few that are still pretty good. And Portuguese Empire Crumbles, which we'll come to next, is a good example of that. Like, it's just a really good access card. It says it's a 2-ops event. It's starred as well, so it goes away once it's played. And it says add 2 USSR influence in both Southeast African states and Angola. So you get 2 influence in Angola, which is that crucial battleground country in Southern Africa, as well as Southeast African states, which is a non-battleground country. And the reason that's quite important is that giving yourself either more stability in Angola or potentially flipping Angola if they only hold it by 1 in the headline phase, for example, which you can headline Portuguese Empire Crumbles, and getting a non-battleground country at the same time can often let you, as the Soviet player, move to a position of domination and then play the Africa scoring card on AR1 if you want to. So Portuguese Empire Crumbles, I think, a very versatile event, one that can lead to good scoring plays, and one to be aware of as the USA player as well, in terms of your play around Angola. You know, any event in the deck that allows the opposing player to just place a number of influence in a battleground country particularly is one that you need to be aware of. Willy Brandt is another one that's less powerful, largely because of the target of the influence. So because West Germany is a 4 stability country, and Willy Brandt says USSR receives 1 influence in West Germany, yes, it will usually break open West Germany, if you like, or remove US control of that country. If the USSR player is eventing this, say they headline it, it's very hard, it's impossible for them to then take control of West Germany, even if they spent their whole AR1 putting a 4-ops card into West Germany, because they would only end up likely, or at best really, one ops ahead, 1 influence ahead in West Germany, and the USA player could then just play back on their turn and fight them, and the USSR player's given up both their headline and their AR1 just to make this play. So Willy Brandt is less about the 1 influence in West Germany kind of flipping the country. And what you'll often find as a Soviet player is the more you can annoy the US player, the more you can misdirect them in the mid-war. Your objective is not actually to take control of West Germany necessarily. It's just to deprive them of control of that country so they have to repair it. And that's where Willy Brandt can actually be a useful event. It also gives 1 VP, which is really important. Like, VPs can't be underestimated, in terms of how important they are to accumulate over the course of the game. Obviously, they're how you win the game, but you've really got to... I think there's been a lot of challenges for players in identifying the balance between how strong a victory point is versus how strong influence placement is. And obviously, it's dependent on a range of factors like whether a region is going to be scored this turn, how evenly balanced the regions are, whether the 2 ops is going to lead to a significant change in the likely outcome of a scoring card that's still available to be played at the time. All of those things can kind of shift the balance of how valuable an ops point is versus a victory point. But a victory point is certainly powerful, and I'd say people have done various different mathematical calculations trying to say is 1 VP in the mid-war particularly. Also, it's worth noting that influence points early are a lot more powerful than influence points late in the game. So if you have Willy Brandt, say, in the later mid-war, like on turn 6 and 7, perhaps the VP then, also obviously depending on where the scoring's at, if you're plus 19, it's going to be powerful, and it's going to win you the game. but a VP then perhaps on turn 6 and 7 might be better than 1.5 or even 2 operations points, in which case you're getting a VP plus you're getting influence in West Germany, which is kind of, let's say West Germany is just controlled by the USA player. Breaking their control might be worth some portion of a future action round as well as this effect of cancelling NATO for West Germany, which can be quite good in the late war if you are attempting some kind of realignments in Europe, which does happen from time to time. You know, there are a range of plays open to the Soviet player, like headlining nuclear test ban and then realigning Europe, which you can play for, although generally, obviously, Europe gets more favourable for the USA as the game goes on. So yeah, Willy Brandt, not the most powerful card in the deck, but a couple of kind of decent effects. And you're always happy when, as the USSR player, the USA player events this, which they will often do because the effects are that impactful, but getting that free VP, very important, or can be very important. Flower Power, similarly, you'll often see the USA player event. You'll rarely see USA player space this because it is a 4-ops card, and there are no USA 4-ops cards in the mid-war, so it's just the early war USA 4-ops, and then the neutral early war 4-ops. Then you've got ABM Treaty, of course, but then the USSR has these 3 mid-war 4-ops. And so you often see Flower Power even more than the others, because both We Will Bury You as a DEFCON suicide, which come to in a moment, and Muslim Revolution with a more powerful effect, you'll often see the USA player have to sort of play around those a little bit, whereas Flower Power, they can sort of take the punt a bit more. So it says it's a start event, so once it's played, it's removed from the deck. It says USSR gains 2 victory points for every subsequently US played war card. It's very clumsily worded. Played as an event or operations, unless played on the space race. And then it lists the war cards. So what this effectively does is, anytime the USA player either plays as an event a war card, or uses that war card for operations, you're going to gain 2 VPs as the USSR player. So it's penalising them for even playing the war cards for ops, which is quite important as well. So it basically makes any war card that they play a must space, which isn't always easy to achieve, and certainly once they get to a certain point on the space race track, they can't space them anymore. So they either have to discard them, hold them, or give you 2 VPs. Generally, as a Soviet player, the event is not worth more than the 4-ops. Just because it's so uncertain, it's within your opponent's control to a certain extent, and it's also, there's an element of randomness to how many war cards they're going to be dealt. But it can be worth 4 or even 6 VPs over the course of the game. I've rarely seen USSR players event it, but certainly, particularly in the early mid-war, so say turn 4 or 5, if you see your opponent eventing this as the USSR player, you're pretty kind of happy about that, I think. It's one of those things that, like Willy Brandt, when you get it for free because your opponent plays the card, you're like, yeah, that's pretty good, but you're rarely going to give up the ops, particularly for Flower Power, being a 4-op card, to get that effect yourself. Lone Gunman is probably one of the most important cards in the deck, in any of the decks, to be aware of. And that's because the USSR, because of the turn structure of the game, doesn't have as many DEFCON suicide threats as what the USA does. So because the USSR player generally gets to play first, and generally gets to play when DEFCON is still above 2, so 3 or higher, the designers of the game have created more USA cards that degrade DEFCON. So if the USSR player draws them, they can actually usually get rid of them on their first action round without losing the game. Whereas the USA player, they don't usually have an action round on their turn, in the absence of something like raising DEFCON with another event. They don't usually have an action round on their turn when DEFCON can be degraded without them losing the game. So that makes something like Lone Gunman very potent, and it means that as long as DEFCON is hovering between 2 and 3, and the USSR player is cooing every turn on their AR1 or degrading DEFCON in AR1 or the headline phase, the USA player can never dispose of Lone Gunman safely, and because it's a 1-up event, they can't send it to the space race. So you'll often see games where the USA player is stuck with Lone Gunman in hand, and they rely on something like Ask Not, the JFK card, to get rid of Lone Gunman from their hand, because that allows them to discard any number of cards from their hand. But in the absence of being able to do that, Lone Gunman can be very potent. And, this happened to me, pardon me, this happened to me in the ITIL finals a couple of years ago, where I had Lone Gunman stuck in my hand as the USA player. And then on turn 8, I think it was, as soon as we went to the late war deck, my opponent headlined Older James, which allows them to see my hand and force me to discard a card. And because I didn't have the China card, when they forced me to discard another card from my hand, it meant I had to play all the cards in my hand, which meant I had to play the Lone Gunman, so I lost the game because there was no way for me to control DEFCON that turn in my hand. So the Lone Gunman is one of the ways that one of the cards that you need to be aware of as both players. Is it still available in the deck? And as the USSR player, if you get to the end of the mid-war and neither player has played Lone Gunman, you know that your opponent has drawn it and that they're probably stuck with it in hand. So it makes cards like Older James a lot more powerful because you can potentially just straight up kill your opponent if they don't have the China card by reducing their hand size and leaving them with the Lone Gunman that they have to play. So that's a very powerful one and one to certainly be aware of. We Will Bury You, similarly, is a DEFCON degrading card, but it's a lot easier for the USA player to deal with because it's a 4-op card, so it can always be sent to space, even if they're under Purge, even if they're towards the end of the space race. Unless they're right at the very end where they have to space 4-op cards, they can still space We Will Bury You. So yeah, they would have to be like at the very end of the space race and under Red Scare Purge in order to not be able to space this. So generally, they're able to deal with it pretty easily, but it generally is a must space. However, if the USA player does have a window where DEFCON is higher than 2, and they can play We Will Bury You, you will sometimes see them event it. Again, it's a start event, so it's removed from play once it's from the game once it's played. But it is worth 3 VPs, and as we were discussing earlier with Willy Brandt, considering the interplay between ops points and VPs, it says, unless UN intervention is played as an event on the US player's next round, USSR gains 3 VP prior to any US VP awards. That just means that if the USA player, for example, uses these 4 operations points, then on their next AR they play a scoring card. They won't actually get the victory points from the scoring card until the We Will Bury You victory points are awarded to the Soviet player. So it just means they can't kind of win the game that way without those 3 VPs from We Will Bury You being taken into account. It also degrades DEFCON. So if they have this window where DEFCON's 3 or higher as the USA player, and they're considering, do I want to try and use these 4 ops, but also give my opponent the event, unless they have UN intervention in hand, which as the Soviet player feels absolutely awful. If your opponent gets the 4 ops from We Will Bury You and then they have the UN intervention, you're like, oh, so lucky. But unless that happens, or unless they have UN intervention in hand, they've got this choice of, do I want to give up 3 VPs in order to get these 4 operations points? And I think more often than not, the answer is no, because if we're sort of looking at during the mid-war period, maybe 1.5 to 2 operations points per VP, the maths really doesn't check out there if they're giving you 3 VPs for the We Will Bury You 4 ops. So that's that one. South African Unrest is another really important card for the Soviets because, like Portuguese Empire Crumbles, it gives you access to Southern Africa. And this is a region that, as the Soviet player, you don't start with any influence in. And unless the USA player spreads from South Africa where they have starting influence, you don't really have an easy way to coup into the region. So you kind of rely on South African Unrest and Portuguese Empire Crumbles as access cards. And because there's 2 of them, there's a decent chance that they're going to come out reasonably early in the mid-war. And you rely on using those usually to get into that Southern African region. So it means that the USA player does have a bit of an advantage at spreading to Angola and Zaire, although obviously that's counteracted by the fact that the USSR player has the advantage of usually being able to coup in AR1. And both Angola and Zaire being 1 stability battlegrounds, they are very vulnerable to those coups. The USSR player obviously has decolonization, which you might get in the early war. deck, and if you do get decolonization, you can obviously spread into any of those African battlegrounds, which is great. But if you don't draw decolonization, or if the USA player draws it and then holds it through the reshuffle to deny it to you, then having South African Unrest and Portuguese Empire Crumbles in the mid-war deck is a really important way for you to get access to that crucial region on the board. So South African Unrest particularly says USSR either adds 2 influence in South Africa or adds 1 influence in South Africa and 2 influence in any countries adjacent to South Africa. So you've got Botswana, which is a 2 stability non-battleground, which is quite relevant and can be quite an important one to control, particularly for realignments on that southern tip of Africa. But you've also got Angola, and you'll usually see people put the influence into Angola if it's uncontrolled. So it can give you a total of 3 influence points as well, it's worth noting, and usually that's the mode you'll see used. So it'll usually be 1 into South Africa and then 2 into Angola. And the powerful thing about spreading your influence across 2 countries like that when you're moving into a new region is it's hard for the USA player to then coup you out of the region entirely. You know, even if they coup Angola or if they realign you out of Angola, you've still got this foothold in South Africa as well. And that can be quite important, particularly early on in the mid-war. Next up, we've got Muslim Revolution, which is the last of the 3 Soviet 4-ops cards in the mid-war deck. It's very, very powerful, and just one that the USA player really needs to be aware of, so they don't overcommit into these countries. So it says it's not starred, so it will get reshuffled into the deck, and it says remove all US influence in 2 of the following countries: Sudan, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Jordan. So that's all of the battlegrounds in the Middle East other than Israel. And it's all the countries in the Middle East other than Gulf states and Lebanon, I believe. So it's also got Sudan, which is a sort of random country in Africa that is not part of the Middle East where all these other countries are located as a region on the Twilight struggle map. Obviously, it's not random in terms of flavor and the reason why it's included, but it's rare that you'll see Sudan be relevant. One way that it can be relevant, though, is that it's an African battleground that the USSR player, knowing that Muslim Revolution affects Sudan, can play 1 influence into Sudan if they need to control an African non-battleground, knowing that if the USA player coups them and rolls really well and ends up with like 6 influence in Sudan or something, maybe later in the game it will be worthwhile removing all that influence with a Muslim Revolution. That's a lot of ifs, and it's kind of unusual that even in that scenario, removing from Sudan would be better than removing from one of the other battlegrounds, particularly in the Middle East, but it's kind of maybe if that's really important for African scoring. But the usual use case for this for the Soviet player will be if the USA player hasn't thought about this or isn't aware of the threat of Muslim Revolution and they overcommit to any of these battlegrounds. You know, if the USA player goes, well, I'm going to take Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and that's 6 influence points, and I've gone into those 2 countries, and perhaps I don't even really have much of a foothold elsewhere in the Middle East. Say they spread, from Israel to Jordan to Saudi Arabia and then up to Iraq, and they commit most of their resources to Iraq and Saudi Arabia because they're both 3 stability battlegrounds, then the USSR player can all of a sudden in 1 action round wipe out all of the influence in those countries, which can be quite a savage blow at a lot of points in the game, particularly if the USSR player has some awareness that the USA player is a little bit light on ops and can't really sort of bounce back immediately into those 3 stability battlegrounds, or if Middle East scoring is impending. So Muslim Revolution, like another card OPEC, which we'll come to later, is one of these power cards in the mid-war that the USSR has access to that affects the Middle East. And it's another reason why, as the USA player, you need to be very careful investing too much into the Middle East. U2 Incident is a 3-op card that is usually the USA player is going to be very comfortable to play. It says the USSR gains 1 VP. It's a start event, so it's going to be removed once it's used. And if UN Intervention is played later this turn as an event by either player, the USSR gains an additional VP. So Usually, UN intervention in this won't be drawn on the same turn, just because of the maths of the deck and how it works, and there has to be those two exact cards drawn on the same turn. But if UN intervention and this are drawn together, maybe you're giving up 2 VPs. But usually what this equates to for the US player is 3 ops in exchange for giving the opponent 1 VP. And usually that's a favourable trade. All the same caveats as with Willy Brandt. Obviously, if victory points are close to 20 in favour of the Soviet player, giving them any extra VPs is very risky. But in general, particularly earlier in the mid-war, you're going to be able to, as the USA player, use these 3 influence points to greater effect than the 1 VP that you're giving up. Liberation Theology is another very important and very powerful access card. So it's kind of similar to decolonization. It's a 2 operations non-start event, so it's going to keep reshuffling. And it says add 3 USSR influence in Central America, no more than 2 per country. I just realized I love the art in the collector's edition on Liberation Theology, so I'm just going to change over to that. I just realized that we're using the regular card art too. There we go. Oh, gosh, this looks much nicer. I thought there was something wrong with the cards. So here we are, Liberation Theology, much nicer artwork. Add 3 USSR influence in Central America, no more than 2 per country. What this allows you to do as the USSR player is firstly gain access to a region that's really hard for you to get into generally. With the exception of mid-war power cards, Junta and ABM Treaty, it's actually quite hard for you to get into Central America. And usually the USA has a significant advantage in those battlegrounds. Obviously, you've got Fidel that can get you into Cuba, but the USA has a significant advantage in Panama and Mexico as well, with the realignment opportunities there being adjacent to the superpower. So early on in the mid-war particularly, having the opportunity to play Liberation Theology and threaten Mexico and Panama, especially if you've already had Fidel evented and you've got those influence in Cuba, can allow you to threaten domination or even control of Central America. And control of Central America is worth so many more victory points for the Soviet player than for the USA player, because you get 1 extra victory point for Cuba and Mexico because they're both adjacent to the USA superpower. So Liberation Theology can lead to some really high victory points plays and is a very important card to control and know about in the mid-war deck. Has it been played yet or has it been spaced? Is it still available in the deck? And what's Central America sort of looking like? And would Liberation Theology be a bit of a blowout if I was the USA player and they played it right now? And conversely, for the USSR player, if I draw Liberation Theology, if I'm sort of fighting a few countries in Central America and thinking about my influence placement, being aware that I might draw Liberation Theology next turn or in the future can impact on how much I want to invest in particular places in Central America as well. Brezhnev Doctrine is a 3 ops start event, and it's effectively a mirror, like a lot of these cards. This is a mirror of the USA card from the early war, which is Containment. It's a 3 ops card and it's starred. So it says all further operations cards played by the USSR this turn increase their ops value by 1 to a maximum of 4. Brezhnev Doctrine, unlike Containment, well, it's a lot worse than Containment for a couple of reasons. So unlike Containment, if Containment's drawn by the USSR player, because you don't go last as the USSR player, if you play the Containment and event it, the USA player still has 1 action round worth of benefit from it on their AR7, whereas Brezhnev Doctrine, the USA player can actually just dispose of this with no penalty whatsoever by playing it on their AR7. So that makes it a lot worse because it's pretty much just a free play on AR7 for the USA player. That being said, the ability to buff all of your plays as the USSR player can be quite important. It can let you space a lot of the bad US 1-ops in the mid-war, because there are a lot of 1-op cards in the USA mid-war deck, if we go back and look quickly, that you really would rather not play. Particularly Panama Canal returned, OAS founded early on in the mid-war, and Sadat expels Soviets to some extent as well, depending on how the Middle East is looking. So having the ability to space those can be important. Also, if you've got too far along on the space race track and you have things like Grain Sales to Soviets or Voice of America and those 2-ops power cards in hand, if you can't normally space them, then being able to space them can be important. But in general, just having a buff to your ops values throughout the turn is quite good. Generally, by the time you get to the mid-war, Marshall Plan and US-Japan Pact will be gone from the deck. if Flower Power and We Will Bury You are removed early in the mid-war, you might not have that many 4-ops cards left in the deck, and you might be drawing a lot of hands with a lot of 2s and 3s. Hopefully not too many 1s, but probably some 1s as well. And turning your 2s into 3s in particular can be really important. So if you've got a hand with a lot of 2s and you've got Brezhnev Doctrine, it could be a really powerful headline to think about, because what having 3-ops cards allows you to do, just kind of in a vacuum, is break control of one of their countries and place a threat yourself elsewhere, or break control of a country and flip it. Like you can flip 1 stability battlegrounds in Africa, or you can usually advance in 2 different places in a meaningful way. So you can take a 2 stability country somewhere and place an influence spreading somewhere else. So on turn 4 or 5, Brezhnev Doctrine during that kind of spread phase can be really, really important, turning your 2s into 3s. But even if you're in a bit of an arm wrestle phase on turn 5, 6 or 7, being able to turn your 2s into 3s and present disruptive plays by breaking their countries and proactive plays by placing into new countries yourself can be quite important, or repairing things that they've done previously to you on their turn can be quite important. So Brezhnev Doctrine, worth thinking about as a headline as a Soviet player, although I know headlines are really at a premium in the mid-war in terms of you want to try and affect the board if you can in some way. But investing in Brezhnev Doctrine, if you're in the mid-war, you've got a lot of 2-ops cards in hand, can be a good play. Allende is another interesting one. It's the only USSR card that gives you access to South America other than de-Stalinization. So we talk about how powerful and important it is for the USSR player to get de-Stalinization in the early war, and how much of a difference it can make to the whole complexion of the game if the Soviets are able to get into South America early with de-Stal. Allende is the only kind of out that they have, other than getting Junta from the neutral deck. Allende is the only USSR card that's going to really give them that access. And so thinking about how to control Allende and whether it's still available can be quite important at certain points in the mid-war, although because the USA player has so many ways to get access through OAS Founded and Panama Canal returns and various other things that allow them into South America, generally by the time you get to sort of turn 6 or 7, one player or another is going to be there, and Allende is not going to have that much of an impact. Where it has the most impact is if you haven't got de-Stalinization in the early war as the USSR player, and you draw this on turn 4. It can make a real difference to how much you're able to pressure the USA player in the mid-war on VPs in those mid-war regions, and it can really turn the game. So can be really powerful, can be really important. But if conversely, if the USA player establishes a bit of a foothold in South America, say they control Chile and they draw Allende, they can usually dispose of it reasonably easily because Chile is a 3 stability country. It is a minor annoyance given this places 2 influence, but is only worth 1 itself. It's not kind of ops neutral as a play for the USA player. It's kind of a minor thorn in their side. It's not the end of the world usually for them to draw it. Cultural Revolution is one of the 3 kind of China card switching cards, like Nixon plays the China card and Ussuri River Skirmish in the USA deck. We've got only 1 in the USSR deck. It's a little bit more powerful than Nixon plays the China card because like Ussuri River Skirmish, it claims the China card face up and available for play. But the other mode, if the USSR player already has the China card, is the weakest of the lot. It just gives the USSR player 1 VP. So Nixon plays the China card, gives 2 VPs. This only gives 1, and Ussuri River Skirmish obviously gives a far more potent effect as well if the USA player already has the China card. So Cultural Revolution, one of its most important uses is going to be as the Soviet player being able to reclaim the China card and either threaten a DEFCON kill with something like Lone Gunman, or just kind of attack the US player's hand size a little bit, or defend your own hand size. If you're stuck with CIA created and a grain sales to Soviets that you can't get rid of because they headlined Cuban Missile Crisis or something, maybe you just really need to reclaim the China card. And Cultural Revolution is a way that you can do that. Although it is a bit of a sign of weakness, I think, to event this. Because it is worth 3 ops as a play, usually as the Soviet player, if you're spending an action round reclaiming the China card just to play it later, that's rarely going to be an ops efficient play. So you're kind of putting a bit of your own blood in the water by playing this for its event. And I think if the US player has one of the China card claiming cards that they own in their hand, they'll probably respond by just taking the China card back, because they'll be able to tell that you really want the China card, or you really want to be able to not play all the cards in your hand. So yeah, an interesting card, but not the most impactful. And certainly a lot of the games, you'll just see the US player play this when the USSR player already has the China card. They just get one VP and the card gets removed from the deck and you never see it again. OPEC is another really important one to be aware of, because it's basically an additional USSR scoring card in the mid-game. So the USSR gets to double up on Middle East scoring, if you like, but OPEC is only the beneficial side of Middle East scoring for the USSR player. So if the USSR controls 3 battlegrounds, which is kind of what you usually have if you're dominating, if you dominate the Middle East 3-2, for example, you'll just get 3 VPs. If you then play OPEC, you get another 3 VPs. So it really is quite similar to the Middle East scoring card in net effect, but where it can be really amazing, because it also includes Venezuela and because it includes Gulf states, which is a non-battleground, you can pick up a couple of extra victory points along the way. So it's one reason that you will sometimes see Soviet players playing to Gulf states, although Gulf states is a 3 stability non-battleground. So it's not super attractive anyway, even if you know that you've got OPEC. But Venezuela becomes a little bit more important because of OPEC, because that extra VP, just picking that up once, possibly twice in the game from OPEC, can make a really big difference. So you'll often see the USA player, if they have the choice between cooing Venezuela and Brazil, opting to coup Venezuela because of OPEC. Shea is the last card in the USSR mid-war deck, and I think as a newer player, it's hard to appreciate exactly how powerful Shea is. Like, it doesn't affect the kind of talismanic countries on the board, like the battleground countries. It doesn't flip domination immediately in a kind of obvious way, but it can be just so strategically important, and it's really, you can use it to a really potent effect as the USA player. As the USSR player, and sometimes as the USA player, you just dread drawing this card and you just think, like, I have to space this, I have to get this out because it's just so bad for me at the moment. So it's a reason why the USSR player might also want to make more plays into non-battlegrounds in Africa, South America, and Central America, because you've got this kind of trump card in the deck that lets you attack 2 of them at once in a really powerful way. So Shea says it's a 3-ups card. It doesn't get removed from the deck when it's played. And it says USSR may immediately make a coup attempt using this card's operations value against a non-battleground country in Central America, South America, or Africa. So those 3 mid-war regions. If the coup removes any US influence, the USSR may make a second coup attempt against a different country under the same restrictions. So it has to be in those regions, but you can make 2 coups in the same turn, which is an extremely powerful thing in Twilight Struggle. Yes, they have to be non-battleground countries, but for example, they can be 2 countries that are adjacent to Nigeria, so that you coup both of them. They can be the 2 battleground countries adjacent to Cuba. They could be 2 battleground countries in South America. For instance, Uruguay and Colombia, which can be really, really important for those realigns in South America. And it just allows, it kind of breaks up some of that, what you can end up sometimes in the mid-war doing, just kind of cooing and counter-cooing in non-battlegrounds. It just gives the USSR player a little bit of an edge in games where that occurs. And if the USSR player knows that they've got this in their hand, they can sort of try and provoke some of those non-battleground country coup wars, knowing that they've got a really powerful response to come back with at the end of the day. So always be aware of Shea, think about it. And if you are the USSR player, you can actually lay out some of that bait sometimes. You can move up next to Nigeria, knowing that if they coup you in one of those countries, you can coup back and coup somewhere else on the board, for example. So that brings us to the end of the Soviet mid-war deck and the end of the card review, actually, this time. I hope you have enjoyed the new player strategy guide for Twilight Struggle. If you've If you have any suggestions for other Twilight Struggle content that you'd really like to see, I will get back to recording more games at some point in the future. As I said in the last video, I have recently just gotten married, and there's sort of a few things going on in the lead up to Christmas, so I haven't had a lot of time for Twilight Struggle gaming, but I do intend to get back to recording some tournament games of Twilight Struggle and doing a few more streams and things like that. But if there is something from a kind of new player perspective or a strategy perspective that you'd like to see discussed a little bit more on the channel as far as Twilight Struggle goes, please let me know. Always happy to hear and happy to have some feedback. And if you're enjoying the content, I hope you've enjoyed the new player strategy series, the card reviews, and that you're enjoying Twilight Struggle. It's a great game, and it's been amazing to see so many people diving into the Itzel, the Ritzel, the Otzel, all the Twilight Struggle leagues and having a blast. Thanks for watching. I've been Jesse Marshall for the Winning Agenda. See you next time.